The content provided in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended for a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your doctor or other qualified health professionals with any questions you may have regarding your medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast.
On today's episode, we will be eating away at how fats and proteins impacts BGLs with dietitian Phoebe Nelson. I'm your host, Isabella McGee. So as someone with diabetes, I've always been told about carbohydrates in foods, and that's always been at the forefront of my mind when I'm eating. You know, how many carbs does this have? Are they low GI or high GI? And because that's what we're told matters. However, sometimes even knowing how many carbs are in the food, and when I've eradicated every other variable I can think of, my BGL still hasn't been as smooth sailing as I expected after eating. And that is quite frustrating. And I wasn't always aware that it could be the fats and proteins in the foods that I'm eating having an impact on my BGLs.
This is Life on the Level. If you're listening, you probably have or know someone with type 1 diabetes. We're here to give you the knowledge and encouragement so you can thrive. Join us as we dive into all things type 1, real experiences, expert insights, and practical strategies.
So today I have an accredited practicing dietitian who also holds a graduate certificate in diabetes education, Phoebe Nelson, with me today to talk a bit more about fats and proteins and some diet considerations for type 1 diabetes. Hi, Phoebe. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Isabella. Thank you for having me.
So firstly, could you tell me about how fats and proteins can impact blood glucose levels?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we all know that carbohydrates or carbs are the main macronutrient that impact our blood glucose levels. Yeah, we know that when we eat carbs, our body's turned into glucose and that raises our blood glucose levels. But we've also found that protein and fat can impact our blood glucose levels too. And I'm sure a lot of people have already found that when they've eaten high fat, high protein meals and they're wondering what's going on there. So I guess the reason that is there's a couple different reasons for why fat and protein can raise your blood glucose levels. And it's different reasons for each as well. So for fat, that can actually slow down the digestion of a meal. So when we eat the food, it moves, goes into our mouth, down our esophagus, into our stomach, into our intestines, and then that's when it's broken down into its tiny little parts. And then but when we have a high fat meal, that slows that process down. So that's when we get that delayed rise in blood glucose levels. So it might not match the profile of the short-acting insulin that you've taken for a meal. And then protein, on the other hand. So protein, when we eat protein, it breaks down to amino acids, and our body can actually turn that into glucose as well, although in a lot smaller amounts than carbohydrate. So on one hand, we've got fat that slows down the digestion and absorption of glucose into the bloodstream, and then we've got protein that's actually generating a bit of extra glucose too. So those two factors together, when we have a high fat, high protein meal, that can result in high blood glucose levels.
It's really interesting because like we're always told, you know, that carbohydrates are the main thing that we should be looking out for, but then we do need to be aware of the other macros as well, I suppose. And with that, how can we determine what a high fat or a high protein food is?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess in saying that, so the reason why we might not always be told about fat and protein is that it doesn't really apply to everyone too. It's pretty individual.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so pretty individual.
Okay.
So some people might say, you know, oh geez, whenever I have a pizza, I find my blood glucose levels really difficult to manage afterwards.
Oh, pizza.
Yeah, pizza, that's the classic one.
The dreaded, classic pizza. Yeah.
Yeah, but some people might say, oh, I have pizza, no worries. So it's pretty individual. So the best way to know if you do need to dose for protein, high fat meals is if your blood glucose levels are above your target range at 3 hours and 5 hours after a meal. So that's the best way to check. If you're 100% sure that you've counted your carbs accurately, but your blood glucose levels are still above the target at 3 and 5 hours, and you've had a high fat, high protein meal, then that's when it might be a good idea to consider dosing for fat and protein too. But, in terms of what high fat, high protein meals are, your standard things that you'd immediately think of, like burger and chips, steak and chips, fast food type meals that have a protein and a fat component like fried chicken. And then, it's your other things too, like with your Asian foods, like your curries that are like based with like coconut creams too. So it might be like a Thai green curry, it might be a butter chicken, those types of dishes. Also your other dishes too that you might have at home, like a lasagna or a shepherd's pie. They're quite high in protein and high in fat too because of the cheese component and the meat component as well. Pastas made with creamy sauces, or meats served with like a gravy as well, because depending on how the gravy's made, that can be quite high in fat. And of course meat has, depending on what kind of meat it is, has a bit of a high fat content as well. And then it's other things too, such as if you're going out for a brekkie, having like an eggs benedict too. You've got high protein from the eggs, but then high fat from the hollandaise sauce. So there's a few different options there, and it might not always be the meal that, you might not immediately think it's high fat, high protein. But it's always worth thinking about if you think, okay, my carb counting's on point, but my blood glucose levels are still above target in 3 and 5 hours. Could it be the fat and protein that's causing this blood glucose rise?
Yeah, I guess with people who, like me, I look at the back of the packet and look at the carbohydrates, and that's how I sort of know. I can sort of tell what has a high carb amount anyway. But is there a certain number that I should be looking at in the fats that will make it be considered a high fat food?
Yeah, there is.
Same with protein as well, I guess. But
yeah, absolutely. There is. So it tends to be if there's more than 30 to 40 grams of protein in a meal, and that's a meal that also includes carbs, or a meal that just has 50 grams of protein but no carbs. So I guess, an example of that, a meal that has more than 30 to 40 grams of protein with carbs, that might be steak, chips and a salad. But a meal with more than 50 grams of protein with no carbs, that just might be steak and salad. So, for example, steak and salad, you might think, I don't need to bolus for that because there's no carbs. But because it's got so much protein, that's when some people might see that they do need to bolus for it. I should say too, when we say 30 to 4 grams of protein, that doesn't mean you've got 30 to 40 grams of steak in there. That means that the actual protein component too. So that's when you've got an app on your phone, if you're able to just look up how much protein is in that per 100 grams and have a bit of a guesstimate too, with that can be useful. And then when it comes to fat, generally a meal with more than 30 grams of fat in it is when people see the need.
Okay, so is that 30 grams of fat per serving size?
It is.
Yeah, so if I'm looking at the back, yeah.
Yeah. So when you're having some oil or butter, that's pretty much almost 100% fat.
Yeah.
So you can pretty much measure it out in that case and be like 30 grams of oil, 30 grams of butter.
Okay.
Yeah, that's going to perhaps cause a rise in blood glucose levels.
I guess so with that, people can eat however they want, but is there a certain way people could be consuming these different types of macros to help with their blood sugars, or is there a certain order that we should consider eating foods for that?
That's a great question. There's been a lot of talk about that. You've seen with social media influencers who promote different ways of eating.
Yeah. That hasn't hit my algorithm yet, thank God.
Okay.
Lucky me. Okay.
Yeah, lucky you. Yeah. But there isn't a strong evidence base to say that we need to eat foods in a certain order for them to have a certain impact on our blood glucose levels. But that's, of course, not disregarding anecdotal or personal experience that someone might have. Everyone has their own experiences where they say, I eat my macros in a certain order, then I have a better impact on my blood glucose levels. And if I don't, that's totally fine if that works for them. But generally speaking, there's no strong evidence to say that we should be eating anything in a certain order. So just enjoy your meal however you'd like.
Yeah, and I guess then if you did want to look into that, it's trial and error and it's personal sort of experience.
Yeah, totally.
Cool.
Yeah, have a chat to a dietitian as well and see if there can be some individualised tweaking to your diet to help optimise it for you as well.
So when you are eating a food that has high carbohydrates and high fats and or proteins as well. That's my insulin pump beeping, apologies. Pizza or pasta that you mentioned. How can we sort of eat those foods as someone with diabetes and have a steady BGL? Because that is quite a battle sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, it all comes down to insulin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, hey. So it is very individualised. So it's absolutely a conversation to have with your doctor, your diabetes nurse practitioner or credentialed diabetes educator about what the best approach is for you. And it also depends whether you use a pump or whether you use multiple daily injections too. So if someone uses a pump, there's options with how their insulin is delivered. So someone might go from using like a normal wave bolus to like a dual or square wave bolus with how their insulin is delivered. And that means the insulin, it's more likely for the insulin profile to cover the rise in blood glucose levels that you would get from a high fat, high protein meal.
Mm-hmm.
It does vary between health professionals and individuals what advice you'll be given and what works for you.
Yeah.
If someone's on multiple daily injections, there is a bit of a general recommendation out there of an additional 10 to 25% of your total insulin need based on the amount of carbs you need. So if you count, you say, I normally have this amount of insulin for this amount of carbs, and then based on how many carbs are in the meal, then you add an extra 10 to 25%. And figuring out what that number is, well, again, that's the conversation with your diabetes health professional. And then taking that extra amount the 15 minutes before your meal. And then checking at that 3 to 5 hour mark to see if that does bring down your blood glucose levels.
So trial and error again a bit.
Trial and error, absolutely. Yeah. For meals that are only protein, so again, like that steak and salad scenario, the general advice for that, again, is a little bit different. And it is to take the amount of insulin you take for 1 unit of carbohydrate for every 50 grams of protein too.
So if I was to give 1 unit of insulin for 15 grams of carbohydrate, I would give 1 unit of insulin for 50 grams of protein.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
You're having 100 grams of protein, then taking 2 units of insulin.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Interesting.
Yeah.
So while we do have you on the podcast today, we're going to change up a little bit. I know some people use certain diets to help manage their diabetes. So some that I can think of are, the keto diet, paleo diet, high carb, low fat, and even vegan. So could you talk me through maybe some pros and cons of a couple of these type of diets?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it's worth saying too, there's no one size fits all approach for diets too. And as I mentioned earlier, there's no strong evidence to support any one dietary approach for type 1 diabetes. But again, there's that anecdotal evidence that people have in there that they say this works really well for me, and that's absolutely fantastic. If people find something that works well for them, that's great. But I guess one that we do often see, the high-fat, low-carb diets, they're pretty topical, they're pretty popular.
Yeah, I did do that one for a while actually, and for me it worked really well, but I think that was also because I was very aware of what I was eating and the amount that I was eating, and there was no sort of variable in the amount of carbs that I was eating or the type of food. So I wonder if my body just liked that less variability in what was happening, but if it works, I suppose.
Well, that's it. Some people say that it works really well for them. But yeah, unfortunately, we haven't seen that evidence on a large scale in studies to make that general recommendation. Yeah, a lot of people report really good results. If you do think a low-carb diet is something that I would like to try, I would encourage chatting to your diabetes health professional, a dietitian, about it to find, is it suitable for you, and the best way to go about it too, because what we really, with food, we want to make sure that we're meeting all our nutrition requirements, that our body's getting all the nutrients and fuel it needs to live every day and have energy to live every day and be healthy. So sometimes when we're reducing certain food groups or cutting things out, some nutrients can be compromised. So it's worth definitely checking in with a dietitian to make sure that you can still tick all those boxes. And also with low carb too, a lot of people think I'm cutting down carbs, I need to be getting the low carb bread and the low carb noodles, making zucchini noodles and all those types of things. But there have been some studies to say that even if we're cutting out what we call our discretionary foods, so things like lollies, biscuits, soft drink, juices, those types of things that are typically quite...
The good stuff.
The good stuff, yeah. Good for our soul.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we're cutting out those things or reducing our intake of them, we can actually reduce our carb intake by up to 70 grams a day. And for a lot of people, that will take them down into the lower carb category and still see those good improvement in blood glucose management. So that can be something, if you're thinking, okay, maybe this is something I want to try, considering how many discretionary foods you're eating first.
Yeah, that sort of makes sense because a lot of it is quite high in carb and sugar. So
yeah.
I guess if you take away that, that would pretty much solve a lot of my issues there, I think. But I guess what about a vegan diet if someone was to consider going on a vegan diet?
Yeah. So vegan diets, we also see lots of people wanting to cut out animal products from their diet, whether it's for, ethical reasons or environmental reasons. And again, I'd encourage you to chat to a dietitian too to make it work for you. There are quite a few nutritional considerations in there because we do get a lot of essential nutrients in large amounts from animal products. So when we cut them out, we need to think about how we're going to replace them. So those key nutrients that we need that are from animal products or found in large amounts in animal products are things like iron, vitamin B12, omega-3, calcium, and protein. It is getting easier and easier for people to follow a vegan diet because there are so many meat and dairy substitutes available now. But one thing to be cautious about with those meat substitutes in particular, so when you go to the supermarket, you go to the meat section and you can get your meat replacement chicken nuggets and chicken schnitzel and sausages, all those ones. So something to be conscious about with those is they're often quite high in salt or sodium. So if you're choosing those products to include in your diet as a vegan, it's good to look for products that have less than 400 milligrams of sodium or salt per 100 grams.
Okay, per 100 grams, right. And I guess that's not to say that we can't find a lot of those nutrients in other foods that aren't animal products. I guess it's just to be more aware that you may be lacking in it substantially because you've just cut out those animal products.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it.
Yeah.
You can get protein really easily from plant-based products such as, your legumes, chickpeas, lentils, kidney beans, 4-bean mix, baked beans. They're really high in protein, as well as things like nuts and tofu. And nuts and tofu are really high in iron as well. And we often associate iron with red meat, but in fact, things like your whole grain breads, your breakfast cereals, your dark green leafy veg, and your legumes, they're really high in iron too. We can get enough iron if we have a variety of those types of foods in our diet and when following a vegan diet. Something that can help if you're not getting any animal-based sources of iron is to have some food high in vitamin C with your iron-rich food because vitamin C helps your body absorb your iron in that.
Yeah, I've heard that you take vitamin C with your iron supplements because it helps absorb it. Yeah.
Yeah, whether it's a small glass of 100% orange juice or a piece of fruit, that can definitely help your body absorb more iron. And then things like with calcium, if you're having a plant-based milk alternative, most of them are fortified with calcium now. It's good just to check on the label to see in the ingredients list that they've had that it's been fortified with calcium. And that'll help you meet all your calcium requirements. Vitamin B12 tends to be the tricky one. Yeah, because that is really, our body only likes the vitamin B12 that is found in animal-based foods.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? But the good news is, you can take a supplement, or a lot of those meat alternatives that we spoke about, a lot of them are fortified with vitamin B12 too.
Right.
So that can be another good way to get it. Yeah.
So is B12 only found in animal products naturally, or where else can you get it?
It is found in plant-based products, but our body tends to not absorb it nearly as well as it does in animal-based products. Yeah, so there are some plant-based products, such as often people will use nutritional yeast, but unfortunately our body doesn't absorb the vitamin B12 in any significant amount that is beneficial to our health. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, interesting. And I guess I know some people who go on these sorts of diets over supplement because they are scared that they are deficient in some foods or whatever. But what would you sort of say around that and around just jumping to supplements straight away?
Yeah, like there are definitely supplements available, but it's always worth checking in with your GP at first and explaining to your GP that you're thinking of going on a plant-based or vegan diet and asking them what, like, I guess, biomarkers, nutritional biomarkers you would need to monitor. So that for most people, that would be vitamin B12 and iron. And what the GP can do is do a baseline blood test and see how your iron levels are and your vitamin B12 levels.
Get your HbA1c done while you're there.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yeah.
2 in 1.
Yeah,
Double it up.
2 in 1. Yeah. Because you want that baseline level, because some people might already be quite low in iron. For some people, a tablet isn't quite enough to bring their iron levels up to store. They might need another option. So a supplement might not always be the best option, but it's always good to get that baseline measurement done to see if you do need it or not. And then, you can check in with your GP 6 months, 12 months down the track to see how your levels are tracking. Do you need a supplement? It's always great to see if you can try and get these nutrients through your diet.
Yeah.
Check in with the dietitian. But if not, and supplements are required, at least you've got that evidence with your blood tests to say your body does need it. Because there can be, if your iron levels are already high and you take an iron supplement, that can actually be quite damaging to your liver. So you don't really want to do that.
So you can technically over-supplement.
You can,
with some things.
You can. Yeah, too much of a good thing, so you can over-supplement. So it's always good to get those blood tests done first before you start taking a supplement.
Cool. So thanks so much for joining me, Phoebe, and have a lovely day.
Thanks so much for having me, Isabella.
Thanks. Always speak to a dietitian or health professional if you have any questions about diabetes and nutrition, and check out our show notes for some helpful links, including the Daphne program.
This podcast was brought to you by the National Diabetes Services Scheme. The NDSS is an initiative of the Australian Government and is administered by Diabetes Australia.
All experiences and opinions described in this podcast are those of each individual guest. Your experience and management may be different.